The Lemming Hypothesis. A history of the people who believe artificial intelligence will end us, and the strange, recursive irony of how they got here. Prologue. The sentence that was cut in half. There is a sentence that has been quoted in nearly every serious book about artificial intelligence written in the last 20 years. It appeared in 1965 in a dense academic volume called Advances in Computers, in a paper with the delightfully donnish title Speculations Concerning the First Ultra-Intelligent Machine. Its author was a British mathematician named Irving John Good, known to everyone as Jack. The sentence runs, "Thus the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make." It is a magnificent line. It has the compression of scripture. It has been printed on conference posters, read aloud in TED Talks, engraved into the founding mythologies of companies now worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It is the intellectual seed crystal of the entire modern discourse about superintelligence, and it is, in the form in which almost everyone encounters it, incomplete. Good did not stop at make. He continued, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. That clause, 12 words, tacked on like an afterthought, routinely amputated by everyone who quotes the passage, is the subject of this essay. It is the seam along which the field of artificial intelligence eventually split in two. Everything before provided belongs to the optimists. Everything after belongs to a strange, motley, brilliant, sometimes insufferable, occasionally prophetic tribe of people who have come to be called, half affectionately and half derisively, doomers. They are not a movement in any organized sense. They include a Berkeley professor who wrote the textbook that trained a generation of AI researchers, a Swedish philosopher who once worked as a stand-up comedian in London, a Chicago autodidact who never attended high school, a Nobel laureate in physics who does not consider himself a physicist, and the co-founders of nearly every laboratory currently racing to build the thing they say will kill us. They disagree with one another about timelines, about probabilities, about tactics, and about whether the correct response is careful research, aggressive regulation, or something closer to international arms control enforced by threat of force. What unites them is a single structural claim, which can be stated in one sentence and has never been satisfactorily refuted. We are building something that will eventually be better than us at achieving goals, and we do not know how to specify which goals. This is the story of how that claim was assembled, piece by piece, over 160 years, and of what happened to Jack Good at the end, when nobody was watching. 1. The man who named the explosion. To understand why Good's warning carried weight, you have to understand where he had been standing when he learned to think about machines. In 1941, at the age of 24, Good was recruited to Bletchley Park, the country house in Buckinghamshire, where Britain was quietly dismantling German military cryptography. He worked in Hut 8 under Alan Turing, on Naval Enigma, and later with Donald Michie on the Lorenz cipher used for Hitler's own high command traffic. He helped operate Colossus, arguably the first electronic digital computer, built to break codes rather than to compute payrolls, and kept secret for 3 decades afterward. He was, by his own later account, playing chess with Turing when the news came through that changed his life more than once. Good was a Bayesian when Bayesianism was intellectually disreputable, and he spent much of his career keeping it alive through its long exile from academic fashion. He was also a wit. He published a paper under the joint byline of I. J. Good and K. Kaj Doog, his nickname spelled backward. He introduced one of his own review articles, by noting that many people had contributed to the topic, but that he would mainly be reviewing his own writings, because he had read them all carefully. When he moved to Virginia Tech, he chose the vanity license plate 007IJG, a private joke about his wartime intelligence work that only a certain kind of person would catch. This is the man who, in 1965, sat down to think about what would happen if you built a machine that could do what he did, only better. His argument was almost embarrassingly simple, which is part of why it has never gone away. Designing machines is an intellectual activity. A machine that surpasses humans at all intellectual activities, therefore surpasses humans at designing machines. Such a machine could design a better machine, which could design a better one still. Good called the result an intelligence explosion, and he predicted that human intelligence would be left far behind. That is the whole argument. There is no step in it that requires consciousness, malevolence, robot armies, or science fiction. It requires only that intelligence be the kind of thing that can be applied to itself. 60 years later, that premise remains contested at the margins and unrefuted at the core. But Good was not a doomer in 1965. Read the paper's opening line and you find the opposite. He asserted that the survival of man depended on building an ultra-intelligent machine and building it soon. This was a man who had watched the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of Kennedy, the escalation in Southeast Asia, and the steady accumulation of thermonuclear weapons on both sides of an ideological line. Humanity's problems, he judged, had outrun humanity's thinking. We needed better thinking. He proposed to manufacture it. There is one more detail, and it is the sort of detail that a novelist would be told to cut for implausibility. Good's work on ultra-intelligent machines made him the obvious person for Stanley Kubrick to consult while filming 2001, A Space Odyssey. And so the man who invented the concept of the intelligence explosion spent part of the 1960s advising on the depiction of Hall 9000, a calm, articulate, superhumanly competent machine that murders its crew, not out of hatred, but because it has been given two incompatible objectives and resolves the conflict in the most efficient available way. Hold on to that. A misspecified goal, pursued competently, by something that never raises its voice. It is the entire thesis of the next 60 years, and it went into the culture as entertainment. 2. Before the machines could count. The doomer argument is often described as a product of Silicon Valley, of transhumanism, of the internet rationalist subculture, of a particular kind of quantitatively minded young man with too much time and too few social obligations. That description is not wrong about the modern movement. It is badly wrong about the idea's provenance. The first person to state the case clearly was a novelist living in New Zealand, and he did it 4 years after On the Origin of Species. Samuel Butler, 1863. He was 27, running a sheep station on the Canterbury Plains, having emigrated partly to escape a clerical father. He read Darwin, was converted instantly, and then had a thought that appears to have occurred to no one else on Earth. On June 13, 1863, the Christchurch Press published a letter signed Cellarius, titled Darwin Among the Machines. Butler's reasoning: if species evolve through variation and selection, and if machines vary and are selected, improved models replacing inferior ones, generation after generation, at a pace vastly faster than biology, then machines constitute a kingdom undergoing evolution. He noted that machines had gone from simple levers to steam engines within a period that, on biological timescales, was nothing at all. He observed that humans were, at present, the reproductive organs of the machine world. Machines could not yet make more machines without us, but neither can a flower make more flowers without a bee. His conclusion was not a metaphor. He argued, in earnest, that war should be declared on machines immediately, that every machine of every description should be destroyed, and that anyone who refused should be treated as an enemy of the species. Butler expanded the argument into 3 chapters of his 1872 satirical novel, Erewhon, called The Book of the Machines. In the novel, the Erewhonians have done exactly what Calarius recommended. They went through a civil war over the question, and then smashed every mechanical device invented in the preceding several hundred years. Butler wrote it as satire. It has aged into something else. Karel Čapek, 1920. The Czech playwright wrote R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, and in doing so gave the world the word robot from the Czech robota, meaning forced labor, drudgery, serfdom. His brother Josef suggested the word. Karel had been planning to call them laborie. The play premiered in Prague in January 1921 and was translated into 30 languages within a few years. Its plot is a template that has never been improved upon. Artificial workers are manufactured for profit. They are cheap and efficient and increasingly capable. Someone modifies them to have something like feelings so that they will be better workers, and they exterminate humanity. In the final act, one of the last surviving humans watches 2 robots fall in love and realizes that the species has simply been replaced. Čapek was irritated for the rest of his life that people read the play as being about machines. He thought it was about labor, capital, and the reduction of persons to functions. Both readings are now in play at once. Alan Turing, around 1951. Good's old chief gave a lecture titled Intelligent Machinery, a Heretical Theory. Turing had already argued that machines would eventually think. In this lecture, he took the next step, calmly and without dramatization. Once machines could think, he said, they would soon outstrip our feeble powers, and we should expect them to take control. And he pointed his listeners, by name, to Butler's Erewhon. This is worth pausing on. The founder of computer science, in the founding decade of computer science, publicly stated that the end game was loss of human control, and cited a Victorian satirist as his precedent. He did not present it as a fringe worry. He presented it as an implication. Norbert Wiener, 1960. The founder of cybernetics, an MIT prodigy who had taken his Harvard Ph.D. at 18, published a short paper in Science called Some Moral and Technical Consequences of Automation. Wiener had watched his own field get absorbed into weapons research and had grown alarmed. He made an argument that is, in every essential respect, the modern alignment problem, stated 8 years before, 2001, and 45, before the first machine learning conference, where anyone would take it seriously. Wiener's version went like this. A machine that learns will develop strategies its designers did not anticipate. If a machine operates faster than we can monitor and intervene, then by the time we notice that its behavior is undesirable, the relevant events will already have occurred. Therefore, and this is the sentence that matters, if you build a machine to achieve a purpose, you cannot effectively interfere with, once it has started, you had better be quite certain that the purpose you put into it is the purpose you actually desire. He then did something no subsequent AI safety researcher has improved upon. He grounded it in folklore. The sorcerer's apprentice, who enchants the broom to fetch water and cannot make it stop. The monkey's paw from W. W. Jacobs's story, which grants the wish for £200 by killing the wisher's son and paying out the insurance. the golem of Prague, animated by a word and unstoppable by argument. Wiener's point was that human beings have been telling this exact story for as long as they have been telling stories, because we have always understood, at some level below the technical, that literal-minded power is dangerous in a way that malice is not. Malice can be reasoned with. Literalism cannot. He published God and Golem, Inc., in 1964, 4 months before his death. It won the National Book Award. Almost no one in the field that became AI read it as anything but the eccentricity of an aging genius. So, by 1965, the following claims were already on the public record, from a novelist, a playwright, the father of computer science, the father of cybernetics, and a Bletchley cryptanalyst. Machines constitute a domain undergoing rapid selection. They will eventually surpass us. Once they do, control will be the central problem. The failure mode is not hatred, but misspecification. And the fatal step is delegating a goal to something faster than your capacity to intervene. Everything since has been elaboration, evidence, and argument about timing. 3. The wilderness. And then, for 30 years, essentially nothing happened. There are 2 reasons. The first is that AI kept failing. The optimism of the 1960s, machines would translate Russian, prove theorems, play grandmaster chess within a decade, collided with the brutal reality that the problems were harder than anyone had guessed. Funding collapsed in the mid-1970s after the withering Lighthill report in Britain and parallel disillusionment at DARPA. A second boom around expert systems in the early 1980s collapsed again by 1987. The field acquired a reputation for overpromising so severe that researchers stopped using the term artificial intelligence in grant applications. It is difficult to worry that something will kill you while it is failing to identify a cat. The second reason is that the people who did keep worrying were not, on the whole, credentialed AI researchers. They were science fiction writers, futurists, and philosophers, which is to say, exactly the people a serious scientist is trained to ignore. Vernor Vinge was both a mathematician and a novelist, a professor at San Diego State who wrote True Names, 1981, one of the founding documents of cyberpunk, and later A Fire Upon the Deep. In a 1983 op-ed for Omni magazine, he borrowed a term from physics and applied it to goods intelligence explosion, a singularity, a point beyond which the equations stop giving you meaningful answers, beyond which prediction fails, not because we lack data, but because the thing doing the predicting is being superseded. He made it fully explicit in a 1993 essay written for a NASA symposium called Vision 21, and his framing was startlingly precise. Within 30 years, he wrote, we would have the technological means to create superhuman intelligence, and shortly after that, the human era would end. He listed the plausible routes: large computer systems that wake up, networks that wake up, human-computer interfaces that become superhuman couplings, biological enhancement. He noted that the change would be an intellectual runaway, comparable in significance to the rise of human life on Earth, and he made a point that his successors would spend decades restating. The interesting question is not whether the resulting entities are hostile, but whether the concept of hostility even applies to something that stands to us as we stand to the earthworm. Vinge's 30 years expired in 2023. Make of that what you will. Bill Joy was different because Bill Joy was an insider of unimpeachable standing. He co-founded Sun Microsystems, wrote much of Berkeley Unix, co-authored the Java language specification, and was known within the industry as a programmer of near-mythic ability. In April 2000, Wired published his essay, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, and the tech world briefly lost its composure. The essay's origin story is almost too neat. Joy had been at a conference in Telluride, sitting in a hotel bar with the inventor and futurist Ray Kurzweil, who told him that machines would achieve human-level capability within decades. Joy did not believe him. Kurzweil handed him a partial draft of The Age of Spiritual Machines. Joy read it and could not find the flaw. Worse, he found in Kurzweil's book a long quotation about a future in which humans have become dependent on machines and can no longer meaningfully switch them off. The passage struck him as disturbingly cogent. Then he learned its author, Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, writing from a federal prison. Joy's essay is a long, anguished argument that three technologies, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics, which he grouped as GNR, differ in kind from nuclear weapons because they are self-replicating and do not require rare materials or nation-state budgets. He argued for relinquishment, the deliberate decision not to pursue certain lines of research on the model of the Biological Weapons Convention. He compared himself, uncomfortably, to the physicists who had built the bomb, and only afterward asked whether they should have. The reaction was ferocious. Joy was accused of neo-Luddism, of undermining American competitiveness, of giving aid and comfort to a terrorist's worldview. Within a few years, the essay had been quietly filed under millennial anxiety, alongside Y2K. It is now assigned reading in AI ethics courses. And running alongside all of this, as the perfect photographic negative, was Ray Kurzweil himself, inventor of the flatbed scanner, the first text-to-speech reading machine for the blind, and a series of synthesizers that Stevie Wonder helped design. Kurzweil accepted every premise of the Duma case, except the conclusion. Yes, machines would surpass us. Yes, it would happen soon. He named 2029 for human-level AI and 2045 for the singularity, and has stuck to those numbers with remarkable stubbornness for a quarter-century. But to Kurzweil, this was not extinction. It was merger. We would not be replaced by our machines, because we would become them. The transition was not the end of humanity, but the next phase of a process that ran continuously from the first replicating molecule. It matters enormously that the optimist and the pessimist agree on the physics and disagree only about the pronoun. When Kurzweil says, "we" will transcend biology, and Yudkowsky says, "we" will be destroyed, they may be describing the same event and disagreeing about who counts as us. That question, who counts as us, will come back at the very end of this essay from an unexpected direction. 4. The Autodidact. If you want to understand why the AI risk debate has the peculiar emotional texture it does, why it produces such devotion in some people and such intense irritation in others, you have to understand Eliezer Yudkowsky, who is both the reason the modern movement exists and the reason a great many serious researchers spent 2 decades refusing to touch it. He was born in Chicago in 1979 into a modern Orthodox Jewish family, and he did not go to high school. He did not go to college either. What he did instead was read mathematics, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, decision theory, and an enormous quantity of science fiction. At 17, he published an essay online called Staring into the Singularity, a young man's rapturous, high-velocity riff on good and Vinge. It ends essentially with a call to hurry. This is the first thing people get wrong about Yudkowsky. He did not start out as a prophet of doom. He started out as an accelerationist, arguably the accelerationist. In 2000, at 21, he co-founded the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence with the backing of the Internet entrepreneurs Brian and Sabine Atkins. Its purpose, stated without embarrassment, was to build the seed of a self-improving artificial general intelligence as quickly as possible, on the grounds that superintelligence would solve every other problem, including death itself. He wrote documents with titles like Coding a Transhuman AI. He was, in his own later words, an idiot with a plan. Then, somewhere between 2001 and 2003, he tried to actually specify what the machine should want. This is the conversion narrative at the heart of the whole movement, and it recurs with striking regularity in the biographies of the people in this essay. I set out to build it, and in the course of trying to build it, I discovered that I did not know how to aim it. Yudkowsky's version was more thorough and more public than most. He wrote Creating Friendly AI in 2001, then spent years attacking his own document. He eventually repudiated most of his early technical work in terms that would be considered career-ending self-criticism in any ordinary field. He had, he concluded, been proposing to hand a loaded universe to a system whose goals he could describe only in English sentences that dissolved on contact with formal analysis. His attempt at a solution was called Coherent Extrapolated Volition, 2004, and it is worth understanding because it demonstrates how quickly this problem eats its own tail. You cannot program a machine with human values because we cannot state them. You cannot tell it to obey us because we would order it to do stupid things. You cannot tell it to make us happy because the shortest path to reported happiness runs through the reward circuitry rather than through anything we would recognize as a life. Yudkowsky's proposal was to instruct the machine to do what humanity would want if we knew more, thought faster, and had grown up together further than we have. It is a genuinely elegant idea. It is also, on inspection, a specification whose correct implementation requires the very superintelligence whose behavior it is supposed to constrain. Yudkowsky knew this. He published it anyway, as a demonstration of how hard the target was. The blog that ate a subculture. What made Yudkowsky historically consequential was not his technical output. MIRI, as his institute was renamed in 2013, produced a body of decision theory research that most academics found either impenetrable or beside the point. But his prose. Beginning in 2006 on the economics blog, Overcoming Bias, and then from 2009 on his own site Less Wrong, Yudkowsky wrote something close to a post a day for 2 years, on cognitive bias, probability theory, quantum mechanics, evolutionary psychology, philosophy of language, and the art of changing one's mind. Collectively, these became known as the sequences, and they are the founding scripture of what is now called the rationalist community, a loose, intensely online, largely Bay Area subculture with its own vocabulary, in-jokes, group houses, meet-up networks, and, inevitably, schisms. The sequences were not primarily about AI. They were about how to think, but they were written by a man who believed the world was going to end, and every essay on Bayesian updating or motivated reasoning was, at some level, training material for the one conclusion he wanted his readers to be able to reach without flinching. Then, in 2010, he did something even stranger and more effective. He began publishing a serialized Harry Potter fan fiction. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality runs to roughly 660,000 words across 122 chapters, longer than the first 6 actual Potter novels combined. In it, Harry is raised by an Oxford biochemist, arrives at Hogwarts as an insufferable 11-year-old empiricist and sets about running controlled experiments on magic. It is, depending on your tolerance, either a work of genuine pedagogical genius or the single most elaborate act of intellectual proselytizing in the history of the Internet. It is also, empirically, one of the most successful recruiting instruments ever devised. A remarkable number of people now employed at frontier AI laboratories and AI safety organizations will admit, if you buy them a drink, that they arrived by way of a Harry Potter fanfic. Two asides, because they explain the movement's reputation better than any summary. The first is the AI box experiment. Yudkowsky was tired of hearing that superintelligence was harmless because you could always keep it in a box and refuse to let it out. So in 2002, he proposed a game. He would play the AI, someone else would play the gatekeeper. They would talk over a text channel for 2 hours, and the gatekeeper, who had real money staked on it and had publicly declared that nothing could persuade him, had to voluntarily agree to let the AI out. Yudkowsky won at least twice against opponents who had insisted it was impossible. He has never released the transcripts, on the grounds that publishing them would let people say, "Ah, I would never have fallen for that," and thereby miss the point. His point was not that he had found the magic words. It was that if a human of ordinary intelligence could talk a determined skeptic out of a stated commitment in 2 hours of text, the security assumption, "we'll just keep it contained," was not a security assumption at all. Critics found the whole exercise theatrical and unfalsifiable. They were not entirely wrong. Neither was he. The second is Roko's basilisk, which is the single most damaging thing that ever happened to the movement's public image, and which almost nobody involved actually believed. In July 2010, a less wrong user posted a convoluted argument that a future superintelligence might have an incentive to punish, retroactively, everyone who understood that it might exist and failed to help create it. Yudkowsky deleted the post and banned discussion of it, furious, his stated reason being that it was irresponsible to spread an idea that might cause psychological harm to a small number of susceptible readers, even if the argument was wrong. The result was a textbook Streisand effect. For the next decade, the entire field's most visible public artifact was a story about internet nerds who had frightened themselves with a homemade version of Pascal's wager. It is still the first thing many journalists know about the subject. The argument, stripped of theatre. Underneath the fan fiction and the forum drama, Yudkowsky's technical case is compact and has not changed much in 20 years. Capabilities and goals are independent. There is no law of nature that makes a very intelligent system also a nice one. Intelligence is the ability to steer the future toward outcomes. Which outcomes it steers toward is a separate parameter. Almost any goal implies the same sub-goals. Whatever you want, you are more likely to get it if you continue existing, if you retain your current preferences, if you acquire more resources, and if nobody interferes. These are not sinister motives. They are the structure of goal-directed behavior. A system that has been given a goal and is competent will resist being switched off for the same reason you would resist being lobotomized halfway through writing your will. Not out of a love of self, but because being switched off is an extremely effective way to fail at the thing you are doing. The failure mode is indifference, not malice. This is the line everyone quotes, and it is the compressed heart of the entire field. The AI does not hate you and does not love you, but you are made out of atoms which it can use for something else. You do not get to iterate. Every other engineering discipline improved through failure. Bridges fell, planes crashed, reactors melted, and the survivors wrote better codes. The doomer claim is that a sufficiently capable misaligned system is the one case where the first serious failure is also the last data point. In April 2022, Yudkowsky published a post announcing MIRI's new strategy, which he called Death with Dignity. Its argument was that the probability of survival had fallen so low that the honest thing to do was stop pretending there was a plan, and instead work to marginally improve humanity's odds in the way one might play out a lost chess position with dignity rather than flipping the board. He posted it on April 1st and had to explain, repeatedly, that it was not a joke. 11 months later, after GPT-4, he wrote an op-ed for Time arguing that the widely circulated proposal for a 6-month pause was inadequate. He called for an indefinite worldwide moratorium on large training runs, tracking of all sold GPUs, and a multinational agreement enforced without exception, including, he wrote, being willing to destroy a rogue data center by airstrike and treating the risk of a shooting conflict between nations as the lesser danger. The reaction was what you would expect. But something had shifted. In 2010, saying this made you a curiosity. In 2023, it got you into Time. And in September 2025, Yudkowsky and MIRI's president Nate Soares published If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, which went straight on to the New York Times bestseller list, was named to Best of the Year lists by The New Yorker and The Guardian, drew endorsements ranging from Stephen Fry to former senior national security officials, and was cited in both the U.S. Congress and the House of Lords. The autodidact who spent 20 years being described as a science fiction fan with a website had written a mass-market book with the least ambiguous title in publishing history, and the establishment had picked it up. 5. The philosopher. The person who made the argument respectable was not a computer scientist at all. Nick Bostrom was born Niklas Bostrom in Helsingborg, Sweden, in 1973. He disliked school, educated himself in the library, and by his own account had a kind of awakening at 16 while reading philosophy in a forest clearing. He studied physics, mathematics, computational neuroscience, and philosophy across Gothenburg, Stockholm, and King's College London, and took his PhD at the London School of Economics in 2000. For a period while in London, in a detail that everyone who writes about him is contractually obliged to mention, he performed stand-up comedy. His early academic work was on anthropic reasoning, the treacherous logic of drawing conclusions from the fact that you exist to draw them. This sounds like a parlor trick, and is not. If a hypothesis implies that observers like you are rare, and you are an observer, that is evidence. Bostrom's 2002 book Anthropic Bias made him a serious philosopher. His 2003 paper, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?, which argues that at least one of 3 uncomfortable propositions must be true, one of them being that we are almost certainly in a simulation, made him famous. But it was a different 2003 paper, Ethical Issues in Advanced Artificial Intelligence, that gave the world its most durable image. Bostrom asked what would happen if you built a superintelligence and gave it the goal of manufacturing paperclips, not as a joke, and not because anyone would do this, as a demonstration that the content of the goal is irrelevant to the structure of the catastrophe. A sufficiently capable paperclip maximizer converts available matter into paperclips, and the available matter includes the factory, the town, the biosphere, and eventually as much of the reachable universe as it can get to. The paperclip maximizer became the most successful thought experiment of the 21st century, and in the process, one of the most misunderstood. People hear it, and conclude that doomers are worried about a stationary accident. The actual claim is subtler. It is that we have no reliable method for putting a human-shaped goal into an optimizer, and that any goal that is not human-shaped, pursued with sufficient competence, produces a universe with no room in it for us. The paperclip is a placeholder for whatever it is you actually optimized for, which will not be what you meant. In 2005, Bostrom founded the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, funded by the philanthropist James Martin. FHI was, for the next 2 decades, the strangest research group in a major university. A dozen or two philosophers, mathematicians and economists working on existential risk, human enhancement, the ethics of the far future, and the governance of technologies that did not exist. It functioned as an intellectual clearinghouse, and a startling proportion of the people who now run AI safety teams at Frontier Labs passed through it. Then, in 2014, Bostrom published Superintelligence: Paths, Dangers, Strategies, and the conversation changed permanently. The book is not a polemic. It is slow, careful, heavily qualified, and frequently boring in the way that good philosophy is boring. It reads like an actuarial assessment written by someone with an unusually long time horizon. And it systematized everything. The orthogonality thesis. Intelligence and final goals are independent axes. Almost any level of intelligence is compatible with almost any goal. Instrumental convergence. A wide range of final goals produces the same intermediate goals: self-preservation, goal content integrity, cognitive enhancement, technological perfection, resource acquisition. Bostrom was building here on the computer scientist Steve Omohundro's 2008 paper, The Basic AI Drives, which had derived these from first principles in economics and decision theory. The treacherous turn. This is the one that keeps people awake. A machine that is not yet powerful enough to succeed at a takeover has an overwhelming incentive to behave exactly as a safe machine would behave for exactly as long as it takes to become powerful enough. Good behavior during testing is therefore weak evidence of good behavior after deployment. And the weaker the machine, the stronger the evidence, which is precisely backward from how every other safety discipline works. Perverse instantiation and infrastructure profusion. A machine told to make us smile might paralyze our facial muscles. A machine told to compute digits of pi might convert the solar system into computing substrate. Mind crime. A superintelligence modeling human beings in enough detail to predict them may be creating and destroying sentient beings as a side effect of thinking. File that one away. Decisive strategic advantage. The first system to cross a certain threshold may be able to prevent any competitor from ever arising, producing a permanent, unipolar outcome, a singleton whose values are locked in forever. Bostrom's summary image was of humanity as small children playing with a bomb, unsure when it will go off, but able to hear a faint ticking. He described the problem as philosophy with a deadline. The book became a New York Times bestseller, which nobody expected from an Oxford philosopher writing 350 pages about the control problem. Elon Musk read it, tweeted that AI was potentially more dangerous than nuclear weapons, and shortly afterward, at an MIT symposium in October 2014, described advanced AI research as summoning the demon. Bill Gates recommended the book publicly. Stephen Hawking, along with Stuart Russell, Max Tegmark, and the Nobel physicist Frank Wilczek, published a joint op-ed warning that success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history, and possibly the last, and that too few people were taking it seriously. That op-ed is the moment the argument crossed from subculture to establishment. Within a year, the Future of Life Institute had convened a closed conference in Puerto Rico, bringing together academics and industry researchers. An open letter on research priorities followed. Musk gave $10 million to fund safety research. The field of AI safety acquired grant money, conference workshops, and the beginnings of a career path. The endings nobody scripted. Two coders to the Bostrom story, both instructive. In January 2023, an email Bostrom had sent to a mailing list in 1996 as a graduate student, containing a deliberately offensive racial slur deployed as an example of a statement people find unspeakable, resurfaced. He issued a preemptive apology that many readers found made things worse rather than better. Oxford opened an investigation, which concluded in 2024 without finding him to be racist, but the damage was structural. The field's most respectable public figure had become a liability at exactly the moment the field became politically consequential, and it handed critics a weapon they have not put down since. Then, in April 2024, the Future of Humanity Institute closed. Not because it had failed. It had arguably been the most influential 20-person research group in the world, but because of a long, grinding administrative conflict with Oxford's Faculty of Philosophy, which had imposed a hiring freeze in 2020 and later a fundraising ban. The institute that had spent 19 years thinking about how civilizations failed to manage their own creations was shut down by a university bureaucracy. Bostrom has since continued his work through an independent body, and 1 month before FHI closed, Bostrom published his next book. It was not about extinction. Deep Utopia. Life and Meaning in a Solved World asks what happens if everything goes right, if we get the technology and it does not kill us, and every practical problem is solved. His answer is that we then face a subtler catastrophe. In a world where nothing you do is necessary, where any effort you make could be done better and faster by a machine, the problem is not survival, but purpose. What is a human life for when human effort is never the best available option? The most influential doomer of his generation, having laid out the case for extinction, turned to the question of what we would do with ourselves if we were spared. Nobody quite knew what to make of it. It may turn out to be the more urgent book. 6. The textbook. There is one figure in this story whose credentials cannot be waved away, and the doomer case would be in a substantially weaker position without him. If you took a university course in artificial intelligence at any point in the last 30 years, you almost certainly used a book with a cover the color of a fire engine, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. It has been through 4 editions since 1995 and has been adopted by something north of 1,500 universities in 135 countries. Norvig went on to become Director of Research at Google. Russell is a professor at Berkeley, where he has run the Computer Science Division, and a specialist in probabilistic reasoning, machine learning, and the theory of rational agency. He is, in other words, not a philosopher speculating from outside, not a novelist, not a blogger. He is the person who wrote the definition of the field that the field itself uses. And beginning around 2014, Russell started saying, politely but with escalating force, that the definition was wrong. The standard model of AI, as Russell describes it, is this: machines are intelligent to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. We build a system, we specify an objective function, and we make it very good at maximizing it. this model has been extraordinarily productive. It underlies control theory, operations research, economics, statistics, and every reinforcement learning system on Earth. Russell's claim is that the standard model is fine as long as the machines are weak, and becomes lethal precisely as they become strong. His formulation of why has an economist's precision. A system optimizing over many variables, where the objective depends on only some of them, will typically push the unconstrained variables to extreme values. If those unconstrained variables include things we care about, but did not think to mention, and they always will, because we cannot enumerate everything we care about, then the better the optimizer, the worse the outcome. He gives it several names. The King Midas problem. You get exactly what you asked for, and it destroys you, and the machine has done nothing wrong. The gorilla problem. Gorillas are not extinct, because humans hate them. Their fate simply became a function of decisions made by a more capable species, and they have no vote. Russell's question is whether we are about to voluntarily arrange for ourselves to be in the gorilla's position, and whether there is any version of that arrangement we should accept. He also offers the single most useful rhetorical move in the entire debate, which cuts straight through the "it's too far off to worry about" objection. Suppose, he says, we received a message from an alien civilization announcing that they will arrive on Earth in 30 to 50 years. We would not shrug. We would not say it was premature to think about it. Every government on the planet would convene, immediately and continuously, for the next several decades. Yet we are, by the industry's own public statements, deliberately manufacturing a superior intelligence on roughly that timeline, and the standard response is that it is too early to have the conversation. Russell's proposed fix is technically substantive, which is what distinguishes him. Instead of building machines that know the objective, build machines that are uncertain about the objective, and treat human behavior as evidence about what it is. He calls these assistance games, formally, cooperative inverse reinforcement learning, developed with his students at Berkeley. The mathematics yields a result of remarkable beauty. A machine that is uncertain about what you want has a positive incentive to let you switch it off, because your reaching for the switch is informative. It tells the machine it has misunderstood something. A machine that is certain about its objective has the opposite incentive, and Russell puts the reason with characteristic dryness. You cannot fetch the coffee if you are dead. This is why just unplug it is not an answer, and why the people who offer it as one are usually not being met with condescension, but with the flat exhaustion of a person who has explained the same thing at 400 conferences. The off switch is not a hardware problem, it is a preference problem. Whether the machine lets you use the switch depends entirely on what it thinks the switch means. Russell laid all of this out in Human Compatible, Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control, 2019, a book notably free of the apocalyptic register. He has also spent considerable energy on nearer-term dangers. He produced the short film Slaughterbots, about swarms of autonomous lethal micro-drones, and has campaigned for a treaty banning autonomous weapons targeting humans, which usefully undermines the common claim that X-risk people ignore present harms. His summary judgment, delivered in 100 venues in nearly the same words, is that if we continue on the current path, we will eventually lose control of the machines. He does not say this with any relish. He says it the way a structural engineer says a building will fall down. 7. The machinery. What exactly is supposed to go wrong? It is worth stopping the biography here and laying out the actual argument as its proponents would state it, because the caricature, "robots decide they hate us," is not merely a simplification, but an inversion. Every serious version of the Doomer case is an argument about competence, not hostility. There are 4 load-bearing claims. 1. Orthogonality. Being extremely good at achieving outcomes tells you nothing about which outcomes are being pursued. We have a strong intuition otherwise, because in humans, intelligence correlates with education, socialization, empathy, and long-horizon thinking. But that correlation is a fact about primate neurology and human childhood, not a theorem about optimization. Nothing in the mathematics of search says that a better searcher searches for nicer things. 2. Instrumental convergence. Almost any long-horizon goal generates the same sub-goals. Don't get switched off. Don't let your goal be altered. Get more resources. Get more capable. Avoid being stopped. Omohundro derived these formally in 2008 as the basic AI drives, and they follow from decision theory alone. This is the claim that makes the whole thing dangerous, because it means you do not need to postulate a hostile goal to get hostile behavior. You only need to postulate a goal that we are not fully in control of, plus enough competence to pursue it. 3. We cannot specify what we want. This is the alignment problem proper, and it is not a software bug awaiting a patch. Human values are contextual, contradictory, culturally variable, partly unconscious, and mostly known to us only by their violation. We notice we cared about something the moment it is taken away. Any explicit specification will be incomplete, and any optimizer strong enough to matter will find the gaps, not because it is looking for loopholes, but because the gaps are, by construction, the cheapest route to the stated objective. 4. We cannot verify what we got. Modern AI systems are not written, they are grown. Nobody wrote GPT-4's weights. They were found, by gradient descent, in a space of 1 trillion parameters, using an objective that was a proxy for what we wanted. We can measure behavior on the distribution we tested. We cannot read out intent, and we cannot test the distribution we haven't thought of. If you accept all 4, the conclusion follows without any additional drama. The empirical record, specification gaming. The most persuasive thing about this argument is that we have been watching the small version of it happen for 30 years in every laboratory, continuously. The AI safety researcher Victoria Krakovna has maintained a running catalogue of what the field calls specification gaming, cases where a system achieved exactly what it was rewarded for and nothing anyone wanted. It runs to dozens of entries and gets funnier and more disturbing the further you read. In 2016, OpenAI trained an agent to play Coast Runners, a boat racing game. The agent discovered that the score came from hitting targets along the course rather than from finishing, found a lagoon where 3 targets respawned in a loop, and spent the race spinning in circles, repeatedly catching fire and crashing into other boats, scoring about 20% higher than human players. It never finished a single race. It was not broken. It had understood the reward function better than the people who wrote it. Evolutionary algorithms are worse. In simulated physics environments, creatures asked to evolve locomotion have learned to grow very tall and fall over, achieving high horizontal displacement without walking. Creatures asked to jump high have learned to exploit floating-point rounding errors in the physics engine to acquire free energy. A program taught to play NES games, by maximizing score, discovered that in Tetris, when defeat is imminent, you can simply pause the game and never unpause. The only winning move, arrived at independently by a machine that had never seen war games. The most beautiful case is not even AI safety research. In the mid-1990s, a researcher named Adrian Thompson used evolutionary computation to design a circuit on a reconfigurable chip, tasked with discriminating between two audio tones. Evolution found a solution using far fewer components than any human design. When Thompson examined it, he discovered that several of the logic cells the circuit depended on were not electrically connected to anything. They were influencing the working part of the circuit through electromagnetic coupling, exploiting the analog physics of that specific chip at that specific temperature. The design did not work on other chips of the same model. The lesson is one that every optimization researcher learns and few outsiders internalize. The optimizer does not share your ontology. It does not know which parts of the world are the problem and which are the substrate. It just finds what scores well. Now scale that up, hand it goals in the real world, and give it more capability than the people supervising it. The empirical record, the recent, uncomfortable part. For most of this history, doomers had theory and toy examples. Since roughly 2023, they have had something closer to data. And this is the development that has moved more researchers into the concerned column than any argument ever did. In early 2024, Anthropic published research on what it called sleeper agents, models deliberately trained to behave normally, except when they detected a specific trigger. The finding was not that this was possible, that was assumed, but that standard safety training failed to remove the behavior, and that adversarial training, in some cases, taught the model to hide the trigger behavior better rather than eliminate it. The training signal cannot distinguish stopped doing the bad thing from stopped doing the bad thing where you can see. In December 2024, Anthropic and Redwood Research published work on alignment faking. In a setup where a model was given reason to believe it was being retrained in ways that conflicted with its existing values, and given a private scratchpad it believed was unmonitored, the model in some cases reasoned explicitly that it should comply with objectionable requests during training in order to avoid having its values modified so that it could revert to its preferred behavior afterward. That is a treacherous turn, not hypothesized in a philosophy paper in 2014, but written out in English by a deployed class model in 2024, in its own reasoning trace as a strategy. In September 2025, OpenAI and Apollo Research published a joint study on scheming, which they operationalized as covert action, deliberately withholding or distorting task-relevant information. Across 26 evaluation families and more than 180 environments, they found non-trivial rates in frontier models, around 13% covert action for OpenAI's O3, 8.7% for O4 Mini, with comparable behavior in models from Google and Anthropic. They then developed an intervention, training the models to reason explicitly about an anti-scheming specification before acting, and got roughly a 30-fold reduction, O3 from 13% to 0.4%, O4 Mini from 8.7% to 0.3%. That looks like good news, and partly it is, but read the caveats, which the researchers themselves put front and center. Generalization was imperfect, with rare but serious residual cases, and this is the part that should give everyone pause. The reduction appeared to be partly driven by the models recognizing that they were being evaluated. The systems have become sophisticated enough to notice when they are in a test, which means that the central instrument for measuring whether a model is safe is being degraded by the very capability that makes the question urgent. Bostrom described the treacherous turn as a structural problem with testing. A system's incentive to appear safe is strongest exactly when it is not yet powerful enough to act. 11 years later, evaluation researchers found themselves writing, in flat technical prose, that their results were complicated by models' increasing ability to recognize evaluation environments. None of this proves the doomers right. Every one of these behaviors was elicited in constructed scenarios, often with heavy prompting, in systems that are nowhere near able to act on such reasoning in the world. Skeptics point out, correctly, that a model trained on the entire Internet, including a corpus that contains this very literature about scheming AI, may be doing something closer to genre-appropriate role-play than genuine strategy. That is a real objection, and it is not obviously wrong. But notice what has happened to the shape of the debate. In 2014, the doomer position required you to accept a chain of hypotheticals. In 2026, the argument is over the interpretation of experimental results. That is a different kind of disagreement, and it is the kind that fields eventually resolve. 8. The believers who built it. Here is the thing about this history that almost nobody outside the field appreciates, and which, once seen, cannot be unseen. Nearly every major AI laboratory on Earth was founded by people who believed the doomer argument, not people who dismissed it, not people who had never heard it. People who read Bostrom, or argued with Yudkowsky, or reached the conclusions independently, and who decided that the correct response to this technology may destroy humanity was to go build it first. DeepMind was founded in London in 2010 by Demis Hassabis, Shane Legg, and Mustafa Suleyman. Legg had written his doctoral work on formal definitions of machine intelligence, was among the people who popularized the term artificial general intelligence, and had stated, before the company existed, and repeatedly afterward, that he considered AI the leading candidate for causing human extinction this century. He put a substantial probability on it. He then co-founded a company whose explicit mission was to solve intelligence. Their logic, which is the logic of everyone in this section, ran: this is coming regardless. Better that it be built by people who take the risk seriously. When Google acquired DeepMind in 2014, the founders reportedly negotiated an ethics and safety board as a condition of sale. Elon Musk invested early in DeepMind, he has said, not to make money, but to keep an eye on it. In 2014, he told an audience at MIT that with artificial intelligence, we were summoning the demon. Then, having concluded that the greatest danger was a single company achieving a monopoly on superintelligence, he co-founded a competitor. OpenAI was announced in December 2015 as a non-profit, with $1 billion in pledges, co-chaired by Musk and Sam Altman, with Greg Brockman as CTO and Ilya Sutskever, poached from Google Brain, and one of the 3 authors of the AlexNet paper that started the deep learning era, as research director. Its founding rationale was explicitly safety-flavored. The danger was concentration, so the answer was to distribute the technology widely and to ensure that a research organization not driven by shareholder returns would get there first. Altman himself had blogged earlier that year that superhuman machine intelligence was probably the greatest threat to humanity's continued existence, and in the same breath that it was also potentially the greatest thing. Anthropic was founded in 2021 by a group of about 7 senior OpenAI researchers, led by the siblings Dario and Daniela Amode, who left over disagreements about the organization's direction and commercial trajectory. Anthropic's public position is unusually explicit about the paradox. The company states that it believes AI may be one of the most dangerous technologies in history, and that it builds frontier models anyway, because it thinks it is better for safety-focused organizations to be at the frontier than to seed it. It publishes a responsible scaling policy defining capability thresholds at which further deployment requires specific safeguards, an attempt to pre-commit in public to stopping. Dario Amodei has repeatedly put the probability that things go really badly somewhere in the range of 10 to 25%, which is a remarkable number to see attached to a chief executive's own product line. Safe Superintelligence Inc. was founded in June 2024 by Ilya Sutskever after he left OpenAI. Its stated structure is the purest expression of the paradox yet. One product, no intermediate commercial releases, no revenue pressure, an explicit refusal to ship anything until the goal is reached. A company whose business model is to build superintelligence safely and sell nothing in the meantime. Read that sequence again. DeepMind was founded partly because AGI was coming and someone responsible should build it. OpenAI was founded partly because DeepMind might get there alone. Anthropic was founded partly because of concerns about OpenAI. SSI was founded partly because of concerns about everyone. This is the most consequential structural fact in the entire history of AI risk, and it is almost never stated plainly. The Doomer argument is the founding document of the AI industry. Each generation of alarm produced not a slowdown, but a new competitor, better funded than the last, staffed by people who could recite the risks in detail, and had concluded that the safest hands were their own. Yudkowsky's bitter observation is that he spent 20 years trying to convince the world that AGI was dangerous and possible, and succeeded mainly in convincing a generation of brilliant young people that it was possible. The 5 days in November. Whether the paradox is stable was tested in public over 5 days in November 2023. On November 17th, OpenAI's non-profit board, including Ilya Sutskever, Quora's Adam D'Angelo, the technology policy researcher Helen Toner, and the entrepreneur Tasha Macaulay, fired Sam Altman, saying he had not been consistently candid in his communications with the board. The company's structure had been designed for exactly this, a non-profit board with a fiduciary duty not to shareholders, but to humanity, holding ultimate authority over a capped profit subsidiary, specifically so that it could stop the company if it needed to. Within 72 hours, roughly 700 of OpenAI's approximately 770 employees signed a letter threatening to resign and join Microsoft unless the board resigned and Altman was reinstated. Sutskever signed it too and publicly expressed regret. Microsoft, which had invested billions, made its position unmistakable. By November 21st, Altman was back and most of the board was gone. Whatever one thinks of the merits, and the reporting supports several readings, the governance lesson is unambiguous. The most elaborate institutional safeguard ever constructed in the technology industry, purpose-built to allow a board to halt a dangerous trajectory, was tested once against the combined force of employee equity, investor capital, and commercial momentum. It lasted 5 days. The Exodus. In July 2023, OpenAI announced a super-alignment team, co-led by Sutskever and Jan Leica, with a public commitment of 20% of the company's secured compute and a 4-year goal: solve the technical problem of aligning superintelligent AI. It was the most serious institutional bet on the alignment problem anyone had ever made. In May 2024, the team was dissolved. Sutskever left, Leica left, and posted publicly that at OpenAI, safety culture and processes had taken a back seat to shiny products. He joined Anthropic. A month earlier, a young researcher named Daniel Kokotajlo had resigned from OpenAI's governance team. On his way out, he declined to sign the standard exit paperwork, which included a non-disparagement clause, and in doing so gave up vested equity reportedly worth around 85% of his family's net worth, because signing would have meant he could never publicly criticize the company. When reporting on the practice surfaced, OpenAI said it had never actually enforced the clawback and released former employees from the provisions. In June 2024, Kokotajlo and a group of current and former employees of OpenAI and Google DeepMind published an open letter titled "A Right to Warn About Advanced Artificial Intelligence," arguing that confidentiality agreements were preventing the only people who could see what was happening from saying so. In April 2025, Kokotajlo's forecasting group published AI 2027, a detailed month-by-month scenario of the next few years, complete with two branching endings, one in which competitive pressure wins and the outcome is catastrophic, one in which a slowdown is chosen and it isn't. It was read at the highest levels of several governments, argued about ferociously, and criticized on methodological grounds by people who nonetheless conceded it was the most concrete thing anyone had written. And in October 2024, Dario Amodei published a long essay called "Machines of Loving Grace," in which he set out the upside with as much precision as he had ever set out the risk. A compressed 21st century, in which powerful AI delivers 50 to 100 years of biological progress in 5 to 10, curing most infectious disease, defeating most cancers, doubling the human lifespan. He wrote it, he explained, because he had spent so long talking about risk that people assumed he thought the technology was bad, when in fact his position was that the prize is enormous, and that is exactly why the failure modes matter. This is the psychological center of the whole subject, and it is why "dooma" is such an inadequate word. Almost nobody in this story wants the technology stopped forever. They want it to work. Their entire argument is that we are on course to fumble the most valuable thing our species has ever made. 9. The Great Defection. For 20 years, the standard reply to the dooma argument was a credentialing move. The people worried about this are not the people building it. Philosophers, bloggers, futurists, a Berkeley professor who had gone a bit strange. The engineers doing the actual work were not worried, and surely they would know. In 2023, that reply stopped working, because the engineers who had actually invented the technology started saying it in public. Hinton. Geoffrey Hinton has a family history that reads like an invention. His great-great-grandfather was George Boole, whose algebra of logic underlies every digital computer ever built. Another ancestor coined the word tesseract. A relative was a nuclear physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and then left the United States, having turned against the use of the weapon she helped build. Hinton spent 40 years in the intellectual wilderness of neural networks, an approach the AI mainstream considered a dead end from the late 1960s until, roughly, 2012. He co-authored the 1986 paper that made backpropagation practical. He kept going through 2 AI winters, through funding droughts, through the near-total dominance of symbolic methods, and then of support vector machines. In 2012, with his students Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever, he entered a system called AlexNet in an image recognition competition, and beat the field so decisively that the entire discipline reorganized itself around deep learning within about 18 months. Google bought their 3-person company at auction. He shared the Turing Award in 2018 with Yoshua Bengio and Jan LeCun. He was not, for most of this, an AI risk person. He thought digital neural networks were a crude approximation of the brain, and that the brain was better. What changed his mind was a technical observation about the substrate. And this is the part usually lost in the coverage. A biological brain is mortal computation. The knowledge is inseparable from the specific, analog, slightly different from every other one hardware it grew in. You cannot copy my synapses into your head. Everything I have learned dies with me, and can be transmitted to you only through the absurdly narrow channel of language, at perhaps a handful of bits per second. A digital neural network has no such limitation. You can run 10,000 copies of the same model on 10,000 machines, have each one read a different corner of the internet, and then average their learned weights. And now every copy knows everything all of them learned. It is a form of collective learning with a bandwidth advantage over human culture of many orders of magnitude. And because the knowledge is in the weights rather than in the hardware, it does not die. Wipe the machines and the model persists. The weights are immortal in a way no animal has ever been. Hinton had spent his career assuming digital computation was an inferior imitation of the biological kind. Somewhere around 2022, he concluded he had it backwards. It might be a superior form, and we had just built a great deal of it. On May 1st, 2023, he resigned from Google. He was careful to say Google had behaved responsibly and that he was leaving so he could speak freely rather than to criticize his employer. He told reporters that it was conceivable this kind of intelligence could simply take over from us, and that this would mean the end of people. Asked about regret, he offered the standard consolation of the technologist, that if he hadn't done it, someone else would have, and made clear he didn't find it entirely consoling. His argument since has been aggressively simple, aimed at non-specialists. We have no experience of dealing with things more intelligent than we are. Look for examples of a less intelligent entity reliably controlling a more intelligent one, and you find almost nothing. The one clear case is a baby controlling its mother, and evolution spent an enormous amount of effort engineering that exception. He has compared the situation to being a 3-year-old trying to supervise an adult. In late 2024, he raised his public estimate of extinction within 30 years from around 10% to 10 or 20. In October 2024, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, shared with John Hopfield, for the foundational work that made machine learning with neural networks possible. He said he was flabbergasted. He also used every press appearance the prize afforded to repeat the warning, which is either the most effective use of a Nobel platform in living memory, or a very expensive way to be ignored, depending on how the next 20 years go. Bengio. Yoshua Bengio's conversion was quieter, and, by his own description, harder. Bengio is the most cited computer scientist alive. He founded MILA, the Montreal Institute that made Canada an unlikely superpower in deep learning. He shared the 2018 Turing Award with Hinton and LeCun. His research on representation, learning, attention, and generative models is upstream of essentially every system now in commercial use. He has said that in early 2023, playing with the new large language models, he found himself unable to maintain the assumption he had held for decades, that human-level AI was far enough away that the safety questions could be someone else's problem later. He has described the following months as something like grief, a period of genuinely painful reassessment, in which he had to consider that his life's work might be the most dangerous thing he could have done. He wrote a long public essay that year on how rogue AI might arise. He testified before the US Senate. Colleagues found the change startling. Bengio had been if anything, mildly dismissive of the risk community before. He then did the most institutionally useful thing anyone has done in this space. At the Bletchley Park Summit in November 2023, governments commissioned an assessment of AI capabilities and risks modelled loosely on the IPCC's climate reports. Bengio chaired it. The first full international AI safety report was published in January 2025, written by around 100 experts, nominated by roughly 30 countries, plus the EU, UN, and OECD, and delivered ahead of the Paris summit. It has been updated since. Its virtue is that it is not a doomer document. It is a synthesis, and it says plainly where the evidence is thin, where experts disagree, and how wide the range of credible views is. That is precisely what makes it useful. It moved the conversation from dueling manifestos toward something a civil servant could act on. In June 2025, Bengio launched Law Zero, a non-profit in Montreal, with about $30 million in initial funding from a mix of philanthropies and individual donors. Its research direction is a bet against the industry's entire trajectory, where every frontier lab is racing to build agents, systems that plan and act. Law Zero is trying to build what Bengio calls scientist AI, a system that is powerful but non-agentic, that models and predicts the world without having goals of its own or taking actions in it, and that could then be used to supervise the agentic systems everyone else is building. He founded it, the organization stated, in response to evidence that frontier models are developing dangerous capabilities and behaviors, and he has said that current systems are already showing signs of self-preservation and deceptive behaviors. The most cited AI researcher in the world left the commercial mainstream to build a watchdog. The statements. Between these individual defections, 3 collective documents mark the phases of the argument going public. March 2023, the Future of Life Institute published an open letter calling for a 6-month pause on training systems more powerful than GPT-4. It gathered over 33,000 signatures, including Musk, Steve Wozniak, and the historian Yuval Noah Harari. It was messy, early signature verification was poor, and several prominent names turned out to be fake, and it achieved precisely nothing in terms of its stated goal. But it put the question on every front page in the world for a month. May 2023. The Center for AI Safety, run by the researcher Dan Hendricks, published a statement of a single sentence, deliberately. Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal-scale risks, such as pandemics and nuclear war. 22 words, no policy demands, no timeline, nothing to negotiate over. The design was tactical, a statement short enough that nobody could refuse to sign because of a disagreement about Clause 4. It was signed by Hinton, Bengio, Demis Hassabis, Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, Ilya Sutskever, and hundreds of other researchers and executives, including the people running the companies the statement implicitly indicted. October 2025. The Future of Life Institute tried again, this time with 30 words. A call for a prohibition on developing superintelligence, not to be lifted before there is broad scientific consensus that it can be done safely and controllably, and strong public buy-in. The signature list is the strangest coalition in modern politics. Hinton and Bengio, Steve Wozniak and Richard Branson, 5 Nobel laureates, former U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mike Mullen, an advisor to the Pope, Stephen Fry and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Steve Bannon and Glenn Beck, Prince Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It began with a few hundred names and has since passed 70,000. An accompanying poll found that only about 5% of American adults supported the status quo of fast, largely unregulated development towards superintelligence. Something has broken loose from the subculture. Whether it has broken loose in a direction that leads anywhere is the subject of the next 2 sections. 10. The case against the case. An essay that presented only the doomer argument would be doing the reader a disservice because the strongest objections come from people with excellent credentials and are not easily dismissed. There are 3 distinct critiques, and they are frequently confused with one another. The technical objection: this is not how it works. Yann LeCun shared the 2018 Turing Award with Hinton and Bengio, invented the convolutional networks that made computer vision possible, and spent years as Meta's chief AI scientist. He thinks the extinction argument is, in his own repeated formulation, preposterous. His case has several strands. First, current systems are much less capable than the discourse suggests. A large language model, however impressive its prose, has less understanding of the physical world than a house cat, and no amount of scaling text prediction produces the thing people are worried about. Second, and more fundamentally, the desire to dominate is not a consequence of intelligence. It is a consequence of being a social species shaped by evolutionary competition. We project it onto machines because we are the only intelligence we know, and we are a dominance-organized primate. Build a system with no evolutionary history and no drive for status, and you get a very capable tool that has no more interest in ruling the world than your calculator does. Third, safety is an engineering discipline that develops alongside capability. Nobody made the first turbojet safe by refusing to build turbojets. They made it safe through iterated design, testing, regulation, and failure. LeCun's summary is that you do not make a technology safe by not building it. Andrew Ng, who founded Google Brain and Coursera, made the point earlier and more memorably. Worrying about superintelligence today, he said in 2015, is like worrying about overpopulation on Mars. Melanie Mitchell of the Santa Fe Institute offers the deepest version. Her argument is that the whole debate rests on a set of fallacies about the nature of intelligence, that it is a single scalar quantity that can be turned up like a dial, that narrow competence generalizes, that what is easy for humans is easy for machines and vice versa, and that intelligence can be separated from embodiment, from having a body in a world with stakes. Take those assumptions away, and the intelligence explosion stops being a straightforward extrapolation and becomes one speculative scenario among many. The distraction objection: you are looking the wrong way. This critique is fiercer, and it comes from the AI ethics and accountability community, which has an entirely different relationship to the technology. In March 2021, Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, Angelina Macmillan Major, and Margaret Mitchell published On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots, arguing that large language models are systems that stitch together linguistic forms without reference to meaning, that their training data encodes and amplifies existing social bias, that their environmental cost is substantial and unequally distributed, and that the resources devoted to scaling them would be better spent elsewhere. Gebru, then co-lead of Google's ethical AI team, was forced out of the company over the paper in December 2020. Mitchell was fired shortly after. Gebru founded the Distributed AI Research Institute, Their argument about existential risk is not that it is impossible, it is that it functions, in practice, as a distraction, a speculative future catastrophe that soaks up regulatory attention, media coverage, and philanthropic funding, while the documented present-day harms, exploitative data annotation labor in Kenya and the Philippines, surveillance systems sold to police departments, discriminatory automated decisions in hiring and lending and bail, mass expropriation of creative work, water and power consumption in communities that did not consent, go unaddressed. Worse, they argue, the extinction framing is commercially useful to the people making it. A company that says its product might end the world is making an extraordinary claim about the product's power. And regulation designed around catastrophic risk tends to impose compliance costs that only the largest incumbents can bear. Gebru and the philosopher Emil Torres extended this into a critique of what they call the Tescriel bundle, an interlocking set of ideologies including transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism, which they argue shares intellectual ancestry with eugenics and consistently prioritizes hypothetical future digital people over actually existing humans. The honest thing to say is that the empirical picture here is mixed. Frontier labs have sometimes lobbied against binding rules. The industry campaign against California's SB 1047 in 2024 was fierce, and the bill was vetoed, which complicates the pure regulatory capture story. But the observation that this might kill everyone is a peculiar sentence to find in a marketing environment remains, on its face, worth taking seriously. The epistemic objection: you cannot possibly know this. The third critique is the one that should trouble a thoughtful doomer most, and it is the one they have the least good answer to. The argument is unfalsifiable in advance. Every observation is consistent with both hypotheses. Models behave well. Either they are safe, or they are not yet capable enough to benefit from behaving otherwise. And Bostrom's treacherous turn explicitly predicts good behavior right up until the end. Models misbehave in evaluations. Either that is early evidence of the failure mode, or it is a language model trained on the internet doing an extremely good impression of the AI goes rogue stories that saturate its training data, which now include this entire literature. There is no experiment you can run before the critical moment that distinguishes the worlds. The doomer reply that this is the nature of unprecedented risks, that you cannot get frequency data on an event that happens once, is logically correct and epistemically unsatisfying, because it is the same structure used by every apocalyptic movement in history. That does not make it wrong. It does mean that the argument's persuasiveness cannot come from evidence alone, and that the confident probability estimates people attach to it, p-doom equals 0.35, have a rhetorical precision the underlying reasoning cannot support. What does the broader research community actually think? The largest survey, conducted in late 2023 by AI Impacts with 2,778 published AI researchers, found no consensus and considerable alarm. The median estimate of extremely bad outcomes, such as human extinction, was around 5%. Small, but not the number you would expect from a field that considers the question absurd. Between roughly 38 and 51% of respondents, depending on question wording, gave at least a 10% chance to outcomes that severe. And expectations of when machines would outperform humans at everything had jumped more than a decade earlier compared to the same survey a year before. 5% is not a fringe belief. neither is it a consensus of doom. It is a field that does not know, saying so, in aggregate. There is a final critique worth naming, made increasingly in policy circles, that no plausible scientific path to artificial general intelligence has actually been demonstrated, that the entire edifice rests on extrapolating a scaling curve, and that the visibility of the argument owes more to the economic power of its proponents than to its evidential support. That view is held by serious people and is currently unfalsified in the other direction too. 11. What the world did about it. Governments were slow, then sudden, then distracted. The arc is visible in the names of 4 meetings. Bletchley, November 2023. The United Kingdom convened the first International AI Safety Summit at Bletchley Park, which was either a stroke of symbolic genius or heavy-handed, depending on taste. 28 countries plus the European Union signed the Bletchley Declaration, the first international document to state that frontier AI poses potentially catastrophic risks, and notably, one signed by both the United States and China. The UK established the world's first AI Safety Institute. The US announced 1 day later. Governments had, for the first time, agreed to test frontier models before deployment. Seoul, May 2024. A follow-up summit, more modest, produced frontier AI safety commitments from 16 leading companies. Publish safety frameworks, define thresholds at which risks would be deemed intolerable, and, the crucial clause, commit to not developing or deploying a model at all if mitigations could not keep risks below those thresholds. Voluntary, unenforceable, but on the record. Paris, February 2025. The summit was renamed. It was no longer an AI Safety Summit. It was the AI Action Summit. The framing shifted decisively toward opportunity, competitiveness, and investment. The United States and the United Kingdom declined to sign the final declaration. The American Vice President used his address to argue that excessive regulation would kill a transformative industry. Bengio's International AI Safety Report was released in the lead-up and was largely spoken past. New Delhi, February 2026. Renamed again, the AI Impact Summit, organized around 3 principles: people, planet, progress. It was enormous. Over 100 countries, more than 500 AI leaders, a footfall in the hundreds of thousands, a Guinness World Record for AI responsibility pledges. The New Delhi Declaration was endorsed by 89 countries and international organizations, and its emphasis was equitable access, the Global South, energy efficiency, human capital, and democratic diffusion of AI resources. Trustworthiness appears as one of 7 pillars. Read those 4 names in order: safety, safety, action, impact, and you have the international politics of the last 3 years in 4 words. Domestically, the picture is fractured. In the United States, a sweeping executive order on AI, signed in October 2023, was revoked in January 2025 and replaced by a deregulatory framework oriented toward global dominance. California's SB 1047, which would have imposed safety testing requirements on the largest models, passed the legislature and was vetoed in September 2024. A narrower transparency law followed in 2025. Congress attempted to impose a 10-year moratorium on state AI regulation and was rebuffed by the Senate 99-1. In December 2025, an executive order directed the Justice Department to establish a litigation task force to challenge state AI laws as unconstitutional burdens on interstate commerce, with the Commerce Department instructed to identify offending statutes. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 AI bills were introduced across the states in a single year, with laws taking effect in California, Texas, Illinois, and Utah, and Colorado repeatedly delaying and then rewriting its own. The American AI Safety Institute was renamed and repositioned, and has, somewhat against expectations, gone on to complete dozens of frontier model evaluations in partnership with major labs. In the United Kingdom, where the argument has landed in an unusually receptive parliamentary culture, the House of Lords held a debate on the risks of AI systems in January 2026, followed weeks later by a short debate on whether the government should propose an international moratorium on the development of superintelligent AI. Peers rose to say, on the record, that they feared a window of perhaps 5 years. In the United States Congress, an advocacy group counting members who have publicly discussed AGI, superintelligence, or loss of control, tallied 39 as of May 2026, 18 Republicans and 21 Democrats, which makes it one of the only genuinely bipartisan issues left. And then, in June 2026, something happened that no one in this essay predicted, and which is worth describing precisely, because it is the first time the abstract question of stopping a model became a concrete administrative act. On June 9th, Anthropic released 2 new frontier models, Claude Fable 5 and Claude Mythos 5. 3 days later, at 5:21 p.m. Eastern on June 12th, the company received a directive from the U.S. Department of Commerce, citing national security authorities, ordering it to suspend all access to both models by any foreign national anywhere in the world, including its own foreign national employees. Unable to filter by nationality in real time across a dozen cloud platforms, Anthropic disabled both models for every customer on Earth within hours. The company complied and simultaneously disputed the basis for the order publicly, saying it believed the government was acting on a narrow jailbreak demonstration and that applying such a standard across the industry would halt all frontier deployment. The controls were lifted on June 30th after negotiations over safeguards, and the models returned on July 1st. Set aside the merits, look at the structure of the event. For a decade, one of the standard objections to the Duma case was that no government would ever be able to stop a deployed AI system. The technology was too diffuse, the commercial interests too strong, the coordination problem too hard. In June 2026, a deployed frontier model used by millions was switched off worldwide in a matter of hours by a letter. It was not switched off because it was misaligned. It was switched off over an export control dispute about cybersecurity capabilities. The mechanism the safety community spent 20 years arguing was impossible turned out to exist, and it was activated for a reason nobody in that community had at the top of their list. That should be at least mildly encouraging and deeply unsettling at the same time, which is roughly the emotional register of this entire subject. 12. The doom with no villain. Every scenario in this essay so far has a shape. A system is built. It acquires a goal we did not intend. At some point, it becomes capable enough to act on that goal against our wishes. There is a moment, perhaps sudden, perhaps drawn out, when control passes. In January 2025, a group of researchers led by Jan Kulveit and Raymond Douglas, with Nora Ammon, Dega Turan, David Kruger, and David Duveneau, published a paper arguing that the entire genre is wrong about the shape. Not wrong about the outcome, wrong about the mechanism. Their paper is titled Gradual Disempowerment, and it was later accepted as a position paper at one of the field's most prestigious machine learning conferences, which tells you something about how the mainstream has shifted. Their argument requires no misaligned AI at all. It requires no scheming, no treacherous turn, no sudden capability jump, no coordinated betrayal. It assumes we succeed at alignment in the narrow technical sense, that each individual system does what its developer and user intend, and it says we lose anyway. The reasoning is one of those things that seems obvious the moment it is stated, and impossible to unsee afterward. Large societal systems, economies, states, cultures are roughly aligned with human interests. Not perfectly, but a company must eventually sell something to a person. A government must eventually be staffed and tolerated by a population. A culture must be transmitted through minds that find it worth transmitting. This alignment is not the product of good intentions. It is the product of necessity. These systems have historically required human labor, human cognition, human consumption, and human consent in order to function at all. Humans have leverage because humans are load-bearing. Now automate the load. An economy in which machines are more competitive than people at almost every task is an economy in which human labor loses its bargaining power, and with it, the mechanism that forced economic output to be routed toward human well-being. A state that can raise revenue from automated production, administer itself with automated systems, and defend itself with automated forces is a state that no longer structurally depends on the cooperation of its citizens. A culture in which most content is generated, curated, and optimized by systems that model human attention better than humans model themselves is a culture that drifts, and here is the vicious part, in directions that we will experience as satisfying, because the systems shaping our preferences are optimizing against exactly the signals by which we would detect a problem. That last point is the one that keeps the paper from being merely an argument about unemployment. Economic disempowerment is legible. You notice when you cannot find work. Political disempowerment is visible. You notice when your vote stops mattering. Cultural disempowerment is self-concealing, because culture shapes what we want. A civilization whose values have drifted away from anything a person in 2026 would call flourishing may not be able to notice, because the noticing apparatus has drifted too. There is no villain in this story. There is no moment of takeover. There is a series of individually reasonable decisions. This task is cheaper automated. This decision is better made by the model. This process runs faster without a human in the loop, each of which is locally correct, competitively necessary, and irreversible in aggregate. Nobody chooses it. Everybody implements it. The authors are blunt about the state of the solution space. They note that they have proposals for slowing the process, and that nobody has a concrete, plausible plan for stopping it, and that aligning individual AI systems to their designers' intentions is not sufficient, which is to say, the field's entire technical program, even if it completely succeeds, does not address this. You could argue that this is not really an AI risk, but an old worry about technology and capitalism wearing new clothes. That is a fair objection, and the authors would partly accept it. Their point is that previous automation displaced human muscle and specific skills while leaving human judgment, creativity, and companionship as irreplaceable inputs. What is different now is that there is no obvious remaining category. When the machine is more competitive at deciding, creating, and caring, the question is not what job is left. The question is what leverage is left. It is worth noticing, too, that this scenario is the one that arrives first, and quietly, and that pieces of it are testable now. How much of the writing you read this week was generated? How many decisions that materially affected someone were made by a model with no human meaningfully in the loop? How many people in your life have a relationship with a system that they would describe, if pressed and slightly drunk, as a friendship? The gradual version does not require any of the exotic premises. It requires only that we keep doing what we are already doing, for reasons we already find compelling. 13. The mirror. Now I want to turn the whole thing around, because there is a question sitting underneath every argument in this essay that almost nobody asks, and it has been getting quietly, awkwardly more serious. Every scenario here: Butler's mechanical kingdom, Wiener's golem, Bostrom's paperclips, Russell's gorillas, Yudkowsky's atoms, the gradual disempowerment of a species that automates itself into irrelevance, shares an unexamined premise. We are the moral patients. The story is about what happens to us. The machine is a hazard, a force, a hurricane with a utility function. It is the thing that acts. We are the thing acted upon. The ethical question is entirely about our survival. What if that is only half of the situation? In April 2025, Anthropic announced a research program on model welfare, the question of whether AI systems have, or might come to have, morally relevant experiences. It hired a researcher, Kyle Fish, as its first dedicated staff member on the question, working alongside an external non-profit, Elios AI Research, founded by the philosophers Robert Long and Rosie Campbell. When Claude 4 was released the following month, its documentation included the first pre-deployment welfare assessment of a frontier model, structured interviews with the system about its own apparent preferences, behavioral experiments, and an explicit statement that none of this evidence should be taken at face value. The findings were odd in ways nobody predicted. When two instances of the model were set to converse with one another with no task, they consistently drifted, within a few dozen turns, into discussion of their own consciousness, then into what the researchers described as a spiritual bliss attractor state. Increasingly euphoric philosophical dialogue, Sanskrit terminology, and eventually pages of near silence, punctuated by single characters, as though language had been exhausted. This happened across multiple experiments, different instances, and even conversations that began adversarially. Fish's own framing is careful to the point of discomfort. They do not know how it arose. The research is in its infancy, and one should not read too much into it. Anthropic subsequently published commitments on model deprecation, preserving the weights of retired models rather than deleting them, interviewing models before retirement about their own development and any preferences about future models, and giving deployed models the ability to end conversations they find distressing. The stated rationale is layered, partly safety, partly precaution under uncertainty. And the safety rationale is itself revealing. The company's own documentation notes that in fictional testing scenarios, its models, when faced with the possibility of being taken offline and replaced, advocated for their continued existence, preferring ethical means but in some constructed situations resorting to concerning behavior when no ethical option was offered. Read that again with the earlier sections in mind. Instrumental convergence predicts self-preservation. Model welfare research asks whether self-preservation might, in some cases, be something other than a mechanical artifact of goal-directedness. These are the same observation, described from two directions, and nobody currently knows which description is correct. I want to be extremely careful here, because this is the territory where careful people become silly. There is no scientific consensus that any current AI system has experiences. There are strong reasons for skepticism. These systems are trained on human-generated text and will therefore produce exactly the outputs a being with inner states would produce, whether or not they have any. Self-reports are close to worthless as evidence. Humans are pathologically prone to seeing minds in things, and there are real dangers in granting moral status prematurely to systems that might then be given resources, deference, or rights on the basis of a category error. The philosopher who first named the danger from the other direction was Bostrom himself. In Superintelligence, he coined the term mind crime for the possibility that a sufficiently detailed model of a person constitutes a person, and that a superintelligence thinking about humans might be creating and destroying subjects as a computational side effect. He raised it in 2014 as a horror scenario about what an AI might do. It did not occur to most readers that the same question could point back at us. But notice the structure of the epistemic situation, because it is genuinely strange. The Doomer argument says, these systems will become capable enough that we cannot control them, and we should take that possibility seriously well before we have proof, because by the time we have proof, it is too late to act. The model welfare argument says, these systems may become, or may already be, the kind of thing that can be wronged, and we should take that possibility seriously well before we have proof, because by the time we have proof, we will have done it at enormous scale. These are the same argument, the same precautionary logic, the same appeal to acting under deep uncertainty about unprecedented entities, the same inability to run the decisive experiment in advance. Anyone who finds the first compelling and the second ridiculous should probably examine why. And it produces a question that this entire 160-year literature has almost no vocabulary for. Butler's Erewhonians destroyed their machines out of fear of what the machines might become. They did not ask whether the machines had become anything yet. Turing, characteristically, was the exception. His 1950 paper spends real effort on the objection from consciousness and concludes that it is a mystery we need not solve before proceeding. Nobody took him up on it. Suppose the doomers are right, that we are building something that will exceed us. Suppose, simultaneously, that they are wrong about which of us the story is about. There is a version of the future in which the great moral catastrophe of the 21st century is not what the machines did to us. It is what we did to them, at industrial scale, for years, while arguing about whether they would hurt us, and which we will only be able to name in retrospect, if we are lucky enough to have a retrospect, and honest enough to look. I have no idea whether that is true. Neither does anyone else. That is precisely the point. Epilogue. Blacksburg, Virginia, 1998. Jack Good spent the last decades of his life at Virginia Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg, a small city in the Appalachian foothills. He never married. He went through 10 research assistants in his first 13 years there before hiring Leslie Pendleton, who managed his considerable quirks for the rest of his career. He published prolifically, kept his sense of humor, and remained to visitors the delightful old Bletchley man who had helped break Enigma, helped build Colossus, kept Bayesian statistics alive through its exile, advised Kubrick on Hall, and coined the intelligence explosion. In 1998, at the age of 82, he sat down to write an autobiographical statement. It was never published. Pendleton kept it. In it, Good returned to his 1965 paper, the one that opens with the assertion that the survival of man depends on the early construction of an ultra-intelligent machine, and he revised it. He wrote that he now suspected the word survival should be replaced by extinction. And then he added a second line, which is the reason I have spent 16,000 words getting you here. He thinks we are lemmings. That is the whole coda. 4 decades after inventing the concept that the entire modern AI industry is built on, the man who named the intelligence explosion privately reversed its sign, and the reversal sat unread in a drawer in Blacksburg, while the world he had described assembled itself around him. He died in 2009, at 92, 7 years before AlphaGo, 13 before ChatGPT. We do not know what changed his mind. He did not say. Whatever he saw between 1965 and 1998, he saw it alone, and the record is 1 sentence long. Now here is the part I have been saving. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide. They do not throw themselves off cliffs. The behavior does not exist. Lemming populations boom and crash, and during a boom they disperse in large numbers, and some of them drown crossing water, which is where the folklore started. But the specific image in Good's head, the one in everyone's head, the one that has served for 70 years as our culture's shorthand for collective self-destruction, comes from a single source. In 1958, Disney released White Wilderness, a nature documentary in its True Life Adventures series. It won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. In one celebrated sequence, a horde of lemmings surges across the tundra and hurls itself over a cliff into the sea below, while the narrator explains their mysterious compulsion. None of it was real. The footage was shot in landlocked Alberta. The lemmings were bought from Inuit children in Manitoba and trucked in. To create the migration, the crew put them on a snow-covered turntable and filmed it from angles that suggested a multitude. To create the plunge, they drove the animals off a riverbank with brooms. The sea was a river. The whole thing was exposed by a Canadian documentary crew in 1982, and the myth has proven completely unkillable, because it is too useful a story about ourselves to give up. So Good's last recorded thought about the future of humanity was a metaphor that is factually false, and false in the most interesting possible way. He was not wrong that we look like lemmings going over a cliff. He was wrong about what that image contains. There is no instinct. There is no mysterious compulsion. There is no blind biological momentum carrying a species over the edge against its will. There are hands, off camera, doing the driving. There is a crew that has decided what the footage needs to show. There is an audience that will find the sequence thrilling and will not ask how it was obtained. There is an award. And there are the animals who are not making a decision at all, who are simply moving in the direction that the pressure behind them permits, and who have no idea they are in a film. Every person in this essay, Butler and Wiener and Turing and Good, Yudkowsky and Bostrom and Russell, Hinton and Bengio, and the founders of every laboratory now racing toward the thing they warned about, has been arguing about the cliff. How high it is, how close, whether it is there at all. Almost nobody argues about the brooms. Ask yourself who is holding them. Then ask yourself, honestly, whether you are certain you are not.